Greetings, friends of liberty. That erstwhile colonial, Thomas Jefferson, is justly admired for his many talents and achievements, but one of the most singular in this regard is a recent scientific discovery, of which he has written in letters to various English friends, of ancient bones and a claw discovered in a cave in Virginia. This claw measures 3 times the length of the claw of one of the lions of Africa. You can imagine how large Jefferson thinks this reputed beast to be. However, if we turn to the fossils of your 21st century North America, we find in this double review the revelation of the owner of this claw and those bones, a gigantic ground sloth, and not a carnivore as Jefferson had imagined. This ground sloth and all things megafauna are discussed in 2 books today: Paul Martin's Twilight of the Mammoths and Ross MacPhee's End of the Megafauna, both written to explore one of the puzzling scientific questions: what killed so many animals weighing over 99 pounds, the megafauna? In this review, we shall compare and contrast the treatment of both books, seeing how they each in their own way approach this enduring question of paleomammalogy. Let's begin with a glimpse of MacPhee's 2019 End of the Megafauna, since this focuses more systematically on the various animals in question. Lavishly and beautifully illustrated by Peter Schoten, with dozens of superb color plates of various Pleistocene animals in their natural habitat, we see, for example, on the front cover, a saber-toothed cat of the Americas withdrawing a fang just sunken into the neck of an enormous 2,000-pound ground sloth. In another plate, a giant elephant bird weighing up to 500 pounds, with eggs over 3 feet long, which nested along the beaches of Madagascar. In another, a goanna, a supersized version of the Komodo dragon, weighing over 1,000 pounds and measuring up to 20 feet long as it lunges at the leg of an Australian wallaby. In another plate, a giant short-faced bear, weighing close to 4,000 pounds as it meanders across the South American pampas, approaching a giant armadillo. In yet another plate, dwarf Maltese elephants and hippos drinking from a lakeside, and giant Maltese swans up to 25% larger than modern trumpeter swans, illustrating the evolutionary environmental pressures of the island effect, which makes animals smaller and birds larger. In another plate, an American cheetah, sometimes reaching over 200 pounds, chasing a pronghorn antelope, which explains, of course, why pronghorns evolved to be so fast. In another plate, a flightless Cuban cursorial owl, topping 3 feet in height, pouncing on a large shrew-like rodent with its enormous talons. And finally, a plate of 2 extinct giant rhinos, the steppe rhino and woolly rhino at over 6,000 pounds, which thrived in the cold regions of the previous ice age. Turning now to Paul Martin and his 2005 Twilight of the Mammoths, we find that the author is also the originator of the famous overkill hypothesis, which argues that as Homo sapiens emerged from Africa around 70 to 50,000 years ago and proceeded to settle the planet's continents, we progressively slaughtered much of the megafauna initially encountered during this expansive period. Martin specifically argues that, number 1, marine animals weren't affected, nor in this period were most small terrestrial animals, which would make sense since these are much harder for humans to kill. Number 2, he argues that overall, climate played little role in megafauna die-off, as shown, for example, by the survival of Ice Age mammoths on Wrangel Island until only 4,000 years ago, and the Pribilof Islands until 6,000 years ago, on both islands undiscovered by man, but mammoths otherwise dying out everywhere else. Similarly, ground sloths survived much later on the Antilles Islands as opposed to the South American mainland. Number 3, the fact that extinctions occurred generally in an eastward pattern, accompanying human migration, implicates humans. So some extinctions occurred in Eurasia early, then in Australia around 40,000 years ago, then in North America around 13 to 11,000 years ago, likely soon after human arrival, and finally, as has been documented by ornithologist David Steadman, the extinction of over 8,000 species of seabirds, such as doves, parrots, and rails, as Pacific Islanders made their way eastward, colonizing the Pacific. In addition, Polynesians reached southwards to New Zealand, where their arrival resulted in wholesale slaughter of the large flightless birds called moas, resident there, and even westward when they colonized Madagascar. As Martin says, recent chronological refinement suggests that Madagascar's giant birds, hippos, giant tortoises, and giant extinct lemurs vanished around the time of human arrival from Borneo over 2,000 years ago. Number 4, Martin and also MacPhee point out how in many island areas, species of birds and animals seem to be behaviorally naive or tame, and this has resulted in many quick extinctions. So, for example, it was reported of the Pacific metallic pigeon. These pigeons were very plentiful and not afraid of man. Ships' crews had no difficulty in catching them on branches because they did not fly away. Once they were captured, their legs were broken, and the cries of suffering from these unfortunate birds then attracted all others in the neighborhood, so they too were then taken. This phenomenon of prey naivete has occurred with island animals as well, such as with some seals and the Falklands Island fox, now extinct. Number 5, Martin also argues that finally in the cave art of Paleolithic times, as in the caves of Indonesia, showing humans hunting pigs and water buffalo, or in Spain showing them hunting deer, we see actual documented examples of megafauna being killed. If now, having seen Martin's basic theory, we turn back again to MacPhee's end of the megafauna, we find that he argues that there are, regarding this extinction event, only really 2 possible types of reasonable explanations. A, some version of Martin's overkill blended at times with B, climatological arguments. He points out that no animal species died out in the Little Ice Age, which was a significant climatological event, but then proceeds continent by continent to differentiate what happened. So number 1, he agrees that Africa and Eurasia have lost comparatively few species. Number 2, that losses in the Sahul, the continent created by the lower sea levels at one time between Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, were mainly climatological after human arrival. Number 3, he says extinctions in the Mediterranean occurred much after human arrival. And number 4, he agrees that on islands like Mauritius, in the famous case of the dodo, extinctions occurred almost immediately. He notes, as Martin does, too, that if the first arrival of humans in the Americas is pushed back before 13 or 14,000 years ago, as some paleontologists now argue, that then the theory would need to accommodate that earlier arrival, explaining why the quick blitzkrieg only happened later. Regarding Madagascar, MacPhee agrees in general, saying that the giant lemurs, giant birds, and other unique vertebrates seem to have mostly disappeared by about 1000 CE, but also adds that there has been some recent discoveries of minor human settlements reaching back perhaps much earlier to 4000 before the present, which would complicate matters. MacPhee continues to try to chip away at Martin's thesis by arguing that the hunter-gatherers who colonized the Americas were more gatherers than hunters. As he says, under what credible circumstances could peoples with unsophisticated toolkits maintain exceptional levels of hunting pressure on not one but many species simultaneously in a manner sufficient to cause the utter collapse of most or sometimes all of them. He also says, regarding the relative absence, except for New Zealand, of kill sites of the megafauna throughout much of the world, an important example of incompliant evidence concerns the almost universal lack of examples of mass kill sites in places where large losses occurred, such as Australia and the Americas. Such sites would be expected to contain not only the remains of numerous animals, but also signs of direct impacts in the form of butchered bones, discarded tools, processing stations, and other earmarks of human presence. But as MacPhee notes, Martin himself offered the following explanation of this, saying, "The big game hunters achieved high population density only during those few years when their prey was abundant. Elaborate drives or traps were unnecessary." And there is nonetheless the evidence of Fell's Cave in Chile, which has many slaughtered horse carcasses, as well as Wally's Beach in Alberta, a mass kill site of camels, as well as over a dozen scattered mastodon or mammoth sites throughout the Americas. Although wanting to approach each of the progressions in each continent uniquely, it can be said that MacPhee agrees in part with Martin, saying, quite apart from this speculation about causation, Martin's specific argument that North American losses were narrowly concentrated in time is held up surprisingly well, although it faces many other complications. At the same time, he says Eurasia was always a problem for Martin's overkill argument. Early hominins of one sort or another are now known to have been present in Europe proper at least 600,000 years ago, and they were hunting. What was missing was an identifiable period of concentrated loss parallel to the one that occurred in the continental New World. At the same time, as he understands, it must be said that these early hominins were not homo sapiens, so perhaps less intelligent and effective hunters. Regarding the continent of Australia, the problem there is simply the lack of much evidence one way or the other for either theory, although MacPhee says Tim Flannery, a prominent Australian mammologist, places a very different spin on the few facts available. His argument implicates humans not only in causing the extinctions, but also in transforming Australian environments. In this variant of the usual blitzkrieg scenario, it is fire in human hands that is the agent of destruction. Thus, Flannery's idea in essence is that Australia was initially forested throughout, and that the humans, through slash-and-burn agriculture or using fire to drive game, destroyed much of the internal habitat of the continent, with forests only being left along the coast. We might call this overburning instead of the overhunting thesis. MacPhee, systematic as always, makes another argument for Martin when he points out that only in North America do we find fossils clearly killed in response to the Yucatan meteor strike at Chicxulub that killed all the dinosaurs, whereas evidence of mass die-out in other areas of the world, which surely occurred, is apparently completely absent. So again, huge die-out of dinos, but only a fossil record in North America. Regarding the related topic of wasteful hunting, MacPhee points out that the practice of many primitive people, such as American Indians with the bison, of only taking select portions of a carcass, such as tongues, after they've killed an animal, which might imply overhunting. But at the same time, he points out too that there are ingenious ways to store meat, such as by smoking or underwater in lakes during wintertime, which would reduce the need for overhunting. Finally, MacPhee turns somewhat critically towards the island tameness syndrome, or prey naivete thesis, pointing out that this phenomenon, which makes animals much more vulnerable, only seems applicable in island situations and has never really been found on continents, perhaps because continents have plenty of predators which islands may not. He also argues that the behavior in wild animals is more learned, unlike domestic animals like cows and sheep, bred for tameness and docility. And so these wild animals should respond more quickly to aggressive humans by learning to avoid them. Having started this review with MacPhee and surveyed both his agreements with and many qualifications of Martin, let's turn to Martin again to give him the final word with the following 2 points. Number 1, he argues regarding the scattered evidence of human presence, such as footprints and potential camping sites in the Americas before Clovis man at 13,000 years ago. Number 1, that these sites in dispute as to what they really contain have often been completely excavated by their initial discoverers, who didn't give opposing paleontologists the opportunity to participate and see the site firsthand before it was finished. Secondly, he says that where they have been invited in, the evidence for this earlier human presence has been underwhelming. And thirdly, summarizing, he says, we know Clovis hunters of Mammoth occupied North America 11,000 radiocarbon years ago. Had people been there at an earlier time and lived as their upper Paleolithic ancestors did in Asia, there should be no difficulty finding archaeological sites older than Clovis. Finally, he brings up the following question from a colleague, Jim Hester, regarding the greater frequency of later bison kill sites. Hester asked him, how can you invoke overkill to explain extinction of the mammoth when we have many more younger sites associated with bison kills? They stretch over thousands of years from Folsom on to Midland. In contrast, there are only a few Clovis associations with mammoth, yet the bison survived and mammoths are gone. His answer to his friend? In the fossil record, a catastrophic event that results in extinction may not last long enough to accumulate appreciable evidence. Honestly, though, I don't think he has a good answer. I think he has a good theory overall, but this answer regarding the bison seems weak. In conclusion, I would rate both of these books highly. MacPhee's The End of the Megafauna an A, and Martin's Twilight of the Mammoths an A-. The MacPhee book is more suited to a general audience, more graphic, and more fun with its many color plates and being 14 years younger, incorporating somewhat newer information. While luxuriating in the happy thought of all those mouth-watering seared steaks of mammoth, ground sloth, and Irish elk that our ancestors enjoyed, I bid you well and remain a hungry Scarlet Pimpernel.